Good afternoon, everyone. As Katrin mentioned, my name is Mark Fliedner. I'm a director at Disability Rights New York, whose programs serve people with physical disabilities and people with significant mental illness. For purposes of visual information, I'm sitting at my desk in DRNY's Brooklyn offices with a bright blue wall behind me, a bookshelf with family photos on it, and a window. I'm a white male with mostly gray hair. I'm wearing brown glasses, a light blue shirt, and a gray jacket with a little bit of black pattern. We are so grateful that you made space to join us for this, the second in our year-long series of events observing the 50th anniversary of Geraldo Rivera's groundbreaking expose on the shocking conditions inside the Willowbrook State School for people with disabilities. The school was located on Staten Island, one of 5 boroughs of New York City. Willowbrook, as we've come to refer to the event, is credited with sparking the public outcry that led to the federal civil rights legislation that today provides the framework within which my colleagues and I at DRNY fight for the rights of people with disabilities throughout the state of New York. We're so pleased in this context to track how far we've come as a state and a nation since 50 years ago, 1972. We're also driven to use this platform to speak of the many ways in which we as a culture still have far to go. Specifically, we at DRNY and those with lived experience daily recognize the places where systems that are sworn to meet the needs and uphold the rights of people with disabilities are failing by virtue of their rather dogged misunderstanding of the daily experience of being a person with disabilities. Despite the legal, ethical, and moral obligation to make these systems work equally and fairly for people with disabilities, we see systems repeatedly fail the folks that we serve. Why? Well, for one thing, those who create and sustain these systems haven't incorporated the knowledge that people with disabilities have with regard to what it means to live their daily lives. As a result, the policies and procedures that are put in place in these systems are literally ignorant of the information required to ensure equal access. This error impacts not only how each system operates, but also how the systems operate in relation to each other. Now, as you're aware, the title of today's event is The Impact of Ableism on Barriers to Communication for People with Disabilities. Ableism means many things to many people, but for the purposes of our discussion today, we'll define ableism as discrimination and cultural prejudice against people with disabilities by physical, mental, and systemic means. Inherent in the concept of ableism is a lack of acknowledgement that people with disabilities may communicate differently from quote unquote able-bodied people. You see, those of us who have gathered for the discussion today have formed a bit of a collective thesis on this issue, that access begins at the beginning, with the most fundamental component of human interaction, the ability to communicate. How do I, as an individual with disabilities, communicate at this particular stage of my life? Do I need assistance? Do I need technology? Do I need more time than others? Do I need more time to process the information that's being given to me in a meaningful way? Do I read, write, type, learn differently than the majority of others? Do I need from my listeners to understand that my presentation of words or images is something they should take the time to learn about in order for it to be truly received? And without these questions being considered and addressed, am I actually being afforded the opportunity to truly access the services that I'm supposed to be being provided? Well, no folks know that better than the smart group of panelists we've gathered for you today. We believe that in part, the system barriers for people with disabilities are created when providers, policymakers, and government agencies do not take the time to learn how individuals with disabilities communicate what they need. That's a big topic to cover in a little over an hour. So we'll focus the discussion on communication barriers to 2 systems in particular that we believe has the most critical and often emergent impacts on our lives: access to healthcare and access to the courts. Let me take a moment to tell you about our host and our panelists. Disability Rights New York is the protection and agency system for the people of New York, and it is charged with provision of legal advocacy for people with all disabilities by means of direct client services, systemic litigation, and community outreach and education. Our objective is always to look at the whole person who presents with a need for advocacy assistance, and where possible, provide technical assistance to such folks in development of their own personal self-advocacy skills. One of our mantras around here is that systems so often create barriers for people with disabilities because people with disabilities did not have seats at the table when the policy and planning for these systems was being developed. And now about our panelists. Michael Cheeseman is a spectacular young man who became quadriplegic several years ago after an accident and then suffered an embolism and was comatose for a period of time when he was dropped from his wheelchair. He now lives in his own apartment with the assistance of a full-time team. We'll share his experience with communication barriers in both the court and healthcare systems. Noorjahan Ahmad, who's a critical but late addition to our panel. Noorjahan identifies as a trans Muslim man who is deaf and legally blind and has other significant disabilities that impact their daily life. They too share their experience with communication barriers in both the court and healthcare systems. DRNY staff attorney Emma Stern has worked with Michael, Noorjahan, and many other individuals with physical disabilities. She's a former public defender who brought to DRNY her knowledge of barriers to the court system. She's recently created a new program, the first of its kind nationally, to address the advocacy needs of those who are pregnant, giving birth, and or experiencing postpartum disabilities. DRNY staff attorney Sabina Khan, also a former public defender, and also part of the Michael team last year, works with people with significant mental illness, including those currently detained in jails and prisons. In fact, she manages New York State's only coalition of advocates for people with disabilities in our county jails. Catherine Salado has her master's in social work, has worked on a mobile mental health response team, has done extensive work with survivors of domestic and sexual violence, including those with mental health diagnoses, and began her career working with veterans at AmeriCorps. She now works in the Victim Services Unit of the Kings County District Attorney's Office. That's in Brooklyn, where I'm sitting. She serves as the Project SAVE coordinator. She'll tell us how that work assists people with disabilities, including their communication needs. And Dr. Nancy Mudrick is an esteemed professor at the School of Social Work, David B. Falk College of Sport and Human Dynamics at the University of Syracuse. She's taught social and welfare policy, mental health policy, research methodology, and international comparison of social work services. She regularly collaborates with the National Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund on policy research and evaluation projects. We are so pleased to have you all. Well, let's begin our discussion at the beginning, and that's why I'd like to turn to Michael. Michael, who also goes by unidentified when he's on Zoom with us. I'd like you, Michael, to take a moment and answer this question for me. And in doing so, I'm hoping you can teach us all your current mode of communication. When you were blocked from being able to speak in your own voice in the court system, and specifically, this would be the court system here in New York City as it relates to your guardianship matter. What did that feel like? Are you using the letterboard?
I'm going to use the board.
Thank you so much.
What's the? Okay, green. A, B, C, D, D. D, I. Was it disrespectful? Is that what you were saying? Disrespected.
Disrespected. And were you ready for the fight of being able to communicate to the court in your own voice? Your answer is no.
I needed help.
I needed help. And for the purposes of our record here today, would you be so kind, is that his mom, Lenore, who's with him and helping him, assisting him
Yep.
today?
Yep.
So can you two describe for us? Oh, thank you. What is it that you're showing us?
So this is the letter board and it has different colors. So Michael will verbally say green, yellow, blue, or red, and then you'll go by each letter and I'll say A, B, and he'll nod. And then we'll write down each letter on here because it's hard sometimes if he has multiple words. And then you can spell out a sentence or a phrase or, it'll help him communicate.
Michael, is it okay with you if I ask Lenore these questions about some of the communication methods that you use? Thank you. I'm going to ask you now, Michael, is it also accurate to say that some who know you well, including some of us who've gotten to know you better, particularly if we're in the same room with you, are able to understand your verbal responses, kind of like a whisper? Yes. Okay. So is it accurate to say that at this stage you use the combination of the sort of one word response and the letter board as needed? And I also want to just clarify, and then I'm going to ask Sabina to give us a little bit more detail. Was there a time when you wanted to speak to the court, but were prevented from doing so by the other parties, the lawyers, if you will, in the room? Okay. With your permission, Michael, I'd like to turn to Sabina now. This is Sabina Khan, one of our panelists who worked with Michael and me to a certain extent in the early stages when we were learning how you communicated and you asked us to assist you. Is that okay, Michael? Great. So Sabina, first of all, how did you go about learning to communicate with Michael?
Sure. And just for our audience, I am a South Asian American attorney. I am wearing a brown t-shirt with a navy suit jacket, and I'm sitting in front of a white wall. My pronouns are she and her. So going to your question, Mark, regarding how I learned to communicate with Michael, should I start with what we learned about Michael's concerns and how we sort of approached Michael in the first place?
That sounds great to me. I want to share as much as we know with the folks that have gathered, and I will just say that because Michael has an ongoing court matter, we're going to be talking about the things that have been decided up until this point in time, folks. So we mean no disrespect and not telling every detail, but I think it's the things that happened at the beginning that are really relevant to the communication issue. So yes, if you would.
Sure. So I first met Michael, along with you, Mark, back in December 2021 upon receiving complaints from various individuals about Michael not having an opportunity to be heard in a guardianship proceeding, despite Michael's continuous requests to be heard. We were also informed that Michael's former counsel did not understand Michael and that Michael was wrongfully being treated as if he was a person who did not have the capacity to understand or communicate on his behalf, even though clearly, Michael, you do understand. And for those who don't know, for our audience, a guardianship proceeding is commenced when a party, such as a relative, alleges that a person with a disability is incapacitated and unable to make decisions with respect to their personal or financial matters. And there has to be a hearing in order to make that determination. And obviously it can be a life-altering decision to be deemed incapacitated and to have somebody else controlling your personal and your financial affairs. And so the allegation that Michael was not being heard in court and that he was being treated as somebody who didn't have the capacity to understand simply because he didn't communicate in the same method that everyone else in the courtroom was using to communicate was something that DRNY took very, very seriously. And so we started an investigation and I met with Michael, and what I learned and you learned, Mark, was that yes, Michael has a physical disability that prevents him from audibly speaking. He could certainly communicate, he could certainly comprehend the information that was conveyed to him, and he could form coherent responses to questions asked of him. We learned he has a big personality. He's very opinionated, very inquisitive, and he was very clear and very adamant about his frustrations with the legal proceedings with us. He told us that his counsel did not ever learn to properly communicate with him, and that his request to be heard by the court was neglected. And so how we learned to communicate with Michael was first through the letterboard and through Michael's aide and through Lenore. We initially asked Michael a couple of questions, and over time we picked up how to communicate with Michael. And I think, Michael, we did pretty well, right? Michael's nodding yes. And we learned, it just takes some time to learn the method of communication. But once we learned it, we were having conversations with Michael. Michael was FaceTiming me. We were having conversations about the legal proceeding. And it was just very upsetting to know that Michael, for all this time as this court proceeding was occurring, was not being heard and was being treated as somebody who can't communicate, even though it was very clear that he could communicate. And so the first step that I took was to write, along with you, Mark, an advocacy letter on behalf of Michael to the court, in which we explained to the court that Michael wants to communicate with the court in person, that Michael wanted to relieve his current counsel. And we took time to explain to the court in the letter the method by which Michael communicates, because it was our understanding from Michael that the court had never been provided the details of what is required to communicate with Michael in a thorough manner, that Michael didn't have an opportunity to show the court how he in fact communicates. And so following the submission of the letter, we were informed by a court employee that there were certainly difficulties, according to them, of putting Michael on the stand, given the amount of time that it would take to have Michael speak, but acknowledged that the judge had reviewed the letter and that the judge was considering how to proceed with the information that we provided in that letter. Following the letter and conversation with the court, we learned Michael still did not have the opportunity to speak on his next court date, but we were advised by the court that we should file a motion on behalf of Michael if Michael wanted to be heard. And Mark, shall I go into the details of what happened next?
Yeah, I think again, there was continued confusion. I thought that might be interesting for folks to know, despite the work that you've done.
Sure. Since it's an open matter, I'm going to give a limited sum and substance of my recollection, observations, and experiences of what happened next. So we filed a motion in order to have the court hear from Michael. And when we got to the courtroom the first day, we noticed, first of all, that the setup of the courtroom was itself limiting and problematic for various reasons. And I'm sure Michael can speak to that also. Understandably, as a result of COVID precautions, there were plexiglasses placed between parties and their mics, and parties had to significantly distance themselves. And that unfortunately made it difficult for parties to hear each other. And there was a podium that was set up, which Michael didn't have access to because he's in a wheelchair. That issue was resolved on the following court date, where for the first time since the proceeding had commenced, and according to Michael, for the first time since Michael had been asking to be heard, the court agreed to set up a time to hear Michael and Michael only. And I really want to emphasize the concerning aspect of all of this, which is the question of whether or not Michael would have ever been heard had DRNY not intervened. And so going into the proceeding, Michael was heard, the proceeding started very early in the morning, I want to say 9:30. It did not end until about 4 p.m. In part, that occurred because there were objections to using Michael's aide as an interpreter, despite the aide being very familiar with Michael's method of communication. And from my own observations, this aide was very quick in his ability to read Michael's lips because the aide had just spent so much time with Michael. But instead, the court asked the court evaluator to interpret for Michael instead, because she was deemed to be a neutral party. And while she graciously did so, and she did the best she could, she just didn't have the experience to quickly pick up Michael's words as communicated, just as quickly as the aide could have. And in fact, I distinctly recall many times where Michael was shaking his head no, because the evaluator wasn't understanding in the moment what Michael was saying. And even a court officer, I recall, watching very intently and oftentimes shaking his head because he too saw that what was being interpreted was in fact not what Michael was saying. So I'm sure Michael can speak to just how frustrating that whole experience was. But on a positive note, the evaluator did, with a lot of time, interpret what Michael was communicating, which was that Michael wanted new counsel, and that Michael wanted to be heard by the court. And the judge did acknowledge Michael's desire for new counsel and replaced his former counsel with DRNY based on Michael's request.
Thank you so much. Michael, I want to ask you one question, and of course then invite you to address any of what Sabina said, but the fundamental question that I think anybody'd want to know is, what are the things about your life that you wanted to be heard about? What are the particular aspects of your life that you want to be in on the decision-making process for? How? How
my money was being spent.
Okay. And when you talk, what Sabina talked about frustrations, the experience of being in the courtroom on that day when we had some barriers. Is there anything else you wanted to share with us about how you felt at that particular moment in time?
My mind.
Do you want to use the letter one?
I think he's saying bed.
Bed.
Oh, my bed.
Okay. Yeah. So that actually leads me to something that I was actually going to turn to, because as we said, we're going to look at the barriers on both the court system, but also healthcare. You had a very significant barrier in terms of your general wellness at that time. Is that fair to say? Okay. And what was the problem?
My bed at the time was
Very.
uncomfortable and
What?
oh, and you have pressure sores because of my bed.
Thank you. Emma, that takes us to the point when you sort of took over working with Michael. Can you just give all of us gathered just a little idea of what the healthcare issue was, and maybe also how it overlapped with the legal issues to create barriers for Michael's safety?
Absolutely. So after Sabina so beautifully teed up the case, then I took over for her on behalf of DRNY and have since had the privilege to continue working with Michael very closely. one of the issues that became abundantly clear right off the bat was that Michael, who is a very tall individual, he's just under 6'5", he was fitted with a hospital bed that was literally too short for his frame and also not wide enough given the length of his arms. And so because of this, he had developed really significant pressure sores that by the point of my involvement had progressed to a stage where it was an incredibly alarming medical concern. And so what needed to be done and what should have been done months before was a bed properly sized for Michael to be purchased and be used for Michael's purposes. But because of the legal structure in place where Michael was not able to make decisions for himself because he has this guardian, all of the decisions had to be made by this guardian. There were ongoing delays and issues that I won't get too into because again, this is an open case, but ultimately because Michael did incredible self-advocacy and was able to communicate in part through me and also through his mother who's here and other parties, including a care coordinator that has been assigned to his case, we were finally able to get Michael a rental bed that was properly sized for an interim solution. And now he has a really incredible bed solution thanks to this advocacy and his ability to communicate, which as Sabina has described prior to more recent events, Michael his voice was being suppressed. And so his ability to communicate was absolutely key and critical in order to allow Michael to get the help that he needed in the medical field.
Michael, was there anything else that you wanted to tell us about that particular issue? You're okay? All right. Thank you. Katrin, who's our hostess, is also going to help host, is going to help me. I don't want to miss anything that any of you have to say. So bear with me as I try and juggle this. The issue of barriers, communication barriers to healthcare and general health wellness is a very large topic. And as I indicated, one of our panelists, Dr. Mudrick, has been working on this for years, along with some partners, and really looking at it from sort of a data perspective so we can establish how widespread the problem is in the context of healthcare. Dr. Mudrick, I don't know if anything that Michael or his current counsel said kind of spoke to you in terms of your research, and if you'd kind of like to expand on some of the communication issues that you've identified in your work.
Sure. I mean, one of the issues that comes up continuously is that the medical profession in particular doesn't believe that the patient knows what they need. And so there's often a discounting of any attempt by the patient with a disability to say, I know the best way to transfer me from my chair to an examination table, for example. And so again and again, one of the most frequent complaints that get filed or that get picked up in surveys, for example, of people with disabilities about their healthcare experience is a real frustration that the medical profession thinks they know better, and they don't listen to the patients. So as I listened to this story, I wondered who made the decision about this bed. And you may not be at liberty to provide that detail, but I'm thinking some medical professionals said this is the bed we use and it's fine, and didn't actually listen to what Michael had to say about his experience in that bed. And I just want to add that this concern about pressure sores was actually the basis of a large lawsuit with Kaiser Permanente out in California. That was brought by a man that was continuously interviewed in his wheelchair only because they could not move him onto a height adjustable exam table, and missed some very serious pressure sores. And he was hospitalized for them at a later time. So in the end, Kaiser spent a lot more money on healthcare had they, than they would not have otherwise needed to spend. And he, obviously, the individual, had a much more painful and serious experience. So Kaiser, actually, with the consent decree, had to make a lot of changes to address that issue.
So interesting. So I got to know Dr. Mudrick when I was doing, my research, getting ready for today, and I came across this article that I want to ask you about. It's entitled, "Can Disability Accommodation Needs Stored in Electronic Health Records Help Providers Prepare for Patient Visits?" And in reading it, I kept thinking about, again, the investment of time, and in the investment of time at the right periods in provider services, right? Can you tell us, I know it's difficult because this is a beautiful, exhaustive report. And by the way, you can find it online like I did, folks. Dr. Mudrick, later on, if you want to put it in the chat, a link, that would be appreciated. But can you tell us the basic themes that you found? Well, basically what your methodology was and what were the themes that you found?
Sure. So I mean, our interest for this work was really what happens in the primary care office, not in a hospital setting. And we were interested to know whether if an electronic health, everyone's under the Affordable Care Act, there's been a big push for all the physicians to adopt electronic health records. And I'm sure all of you have seen that when you go to the physician now, there's an electronic health record. Mm-hmm. So the question was, if we have this information in the electronic health record, can we also add information about what a patient needs as an accommodation to facilitate that particular visit with the physician? And we actually worked with a local federally qualified health center up in the Bay Area that had on its own added 4 questions about what accommodations you might need and put it in their electronic health record. And so with my partner, Mary Lou Breslin from the Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund, we talked to the staff of the health center. We talked to a group of the receptionists, the physicians, the physician assistants, nurses. There was a social worker in the group and some people who do make appointments. When you get a referral, they'll call forward for the appointment. And we asked them about this information. And among the things we learned was, well, yeah, it was in the health record, but they weren't actually reading it very much. So they didn't always know ahead of time what they needed to do to prepare, even though there was some information in the record. With the exception actually of ASL interpreters, they tended to be responsive to that was in the record. No, notice I know.
No, they don't.
I'll say they told us they were responsive.
Yeah.
But other information, they were not extremely responsive to in terms of what they saw in the health record. On the other hand, this federally qualified health center was staffed with people who were creative in many ways. When patients came in who needed accommodation, they did the best they could within the limitations. And if we're speaking about communication issues in particular, one of the issues that seemed really difficult was creating a longer visit time period to allow for communication. That the standard 15-minute period was just not long enough. And it was interesting to hear the staff at this health center talk about they weren't even sure if they were allowed to make a longer appointment slot because the schedule was so regulated. So on the information that they collected, they asked people, do you need a longer appointment? And people would say yes. And there were people who checked that box and said, yes, I generally will need a longer appointment for communication purposes or for understanding purposes and sometimes for just movement issues. And so forth. And they found it very hard under their medical system to always accommodate that. So if they knew they had a patient who needed a longer time period, but they could only give that patient a 15-minute slot, they would try to schedule the patient for just before lunch so that they knew this appointment could squeeze out into the lunch hour, and they were willing to let that happen. So to go back to what you said originally, Mark, when you were introducing it, this is an example of a sort of systemic issue, a structural issue that that needs greater attention, and it's probably, you know, it's a systemic issue for us all, but it's one that's kind of hard to get into and to sort of make change, because we've got a very sort of well-developed health system that's very rote and regularized in how we deliver care to individuals. I don't know if there's other parts of this you wanted me to talk
Well,
about.
no, yeah, I think, I mean, it just strikes me that that during the initial communication with a patient, that finding out what accommodations, including extra time or an ASL interpreter or you know, some other kind of accommodation is necessary, while that's going to be time spent on the phone, then it's going to be a lot of time saved and a lot more better care if that's built in to our system electronically and otherwise. That's what I take away in part from what you're saying. Now, I'm going to kind of go back and forth with folks because you all have interesting pieces of this. Apropos to the topic that you've been talking about, and with some communication that you got from one of our other panelists who was eager to tell us their story. Emma had another client who has a sort of an extraordinary healthcare challenge issue that I'd like to ask Noorjahan Ahmad to share with us at this time. Hi, Noorjahan.
Hello, my name is Noorjahan Ahmad. I am a trans person, so I can give birth, and I did give birth. And I have two beautiful children. In part, thank you to the service that DRNY gave me for the second birth. So a little bit about my story. I am deaf and I am blind and I'm in a wheelchair. The first birth, I had an interpreter lined up and they sent him home the last minute. So I didn't have an interpreter, which led to a lot of issues. So going into this pregnancy and this birthing process, I knew that access to interpreters was going to be critical for me to understand and for me to ultimately end up with the best result for me and my child. The journey was a very long one. And I spent a lot of time thinking it would just kind of get better on its own because the OBGYN was amazing. She fully understood that I needed ASL interpreters in person, that the iPad was too small for my vision difficulties. And every time I had an appointment at the office, it was well done and exceptional. The problem I ran into is more with the hospital. She worked for the same hospital, but because the systems were separate, her communication with them ultimately led to problems of them understanding what I needed. A lot of incidences had actually occurred where the hospital, due to a lack of interpreter, had put me in physical danger and the child in physical danger on numerous occasions because they didn't have the ability to communicate. They would try to substitute family or friends as interpreters, which is not great because they can be biased. They are also in a very heavily emotional situation at that time. So that's not fair to ask of them to be able to communicate with me properly. And ultimately, the reason I ended up asking for the help from DRNY was because we were so close to the birth and everything had been set up so perfectly so many times by the OBGYN, only to have the hospital itself change the plan again. And I got fed up and I said, look, I cannot give birth to this baby safely without this access need being met. And so that's kind of where I originally ended up being able to reach out. And then thanks to the help of DRNY, I was able to have those interpreters for those very important and critical moments. For example, I was in labor and I was told I had to stop pushing. If I had not had an ASL interpreter, I would have never known to stop pushing. And that could have led to very serious health consequences for me or the unborn child at that time. But because I had that access, I knew to stop pushing. And the doctor was able to check in with me about how things were going continuously until it was time to start pushing again almost an hour later. And because of that access to that interpreter and knowing when I could start pushing again, my baby was born healthy, completely healthy and beautiful. And it was honestly one of the best birthing experiences I've had. And it was because of that access need being met.
Thank you. That was really informative. I keep learning from all of you, but I learned from Noorjahan. Another thing that I wanted to bring out with folks, you've always noted the need for a specific type of ASL interpreter, depending on what the situation is, right? And could you just sort of like talk to us all about what you mean by that?
Yes, of course. So I am deafblind, but that doesn't mean I am completely deaf, and it doesn't mean I'm completely blind. A lot of misconceptions are that blind people can't see anything or deaf people can't hear anything. There's a very large range and spectrum for what disability of those types and in general can encompass. So oftentimes what I was finding when trying to access American Sign Language interpreters was that either they were trying to give me an iPad because they could assume that I could see better than I could because I use an iPad for communication to tell them what I needed, or I would be trying to access the interpreter in person and they would send the wrong type of interpreter because there are many different forms of sign language. So when it comes down to medical appointments, and it was not just in relation to this incident, but just in general, I often have to advocate specifically for what type of interpreter that I need in a medical setting. Additionally, there's a huge difference between court system interpreting and medical system interpreting that I think is often not known about, because an interpreter is trained in very specific things. So if an interpreter needs to be able to communicate something that's medically relevant and doesn't have the sign language capacity for that, like interpreting skill, then it leaves everyone almost questioning what the context is, trying to figure it out, and those kinds of things. A lot of what I do lip reading wise is context based, and I don't get a lot. I get 13%, and that's like on my best days, right? And there is a statistic that shows even the best FBI profilers whose jobs are to lip read from a distance get 30%, and the rest is purely context. And they have hearing and all of their senses intact. So for me, having the proper interpreter makes a big difference.
Based upon your experiences with mental health or physical health providers who you've been communicating with, are there assumptions made sometimes about what you are, the information that you're getting from them and how you're digesting it? And is that critical to whether or not you have an interpreter available?
Yes. Oh yeah, so you just saw, I was watching the interpreter, right? And I was nodding. So it's a huge thing that deaf people, and me in particularly, do, is I will nod along to the conversation as if I understand. So a lot of times I get the phrase to me that says, oh, but we understand you. So it's not a problem. You don't need an interpreter. And I have to reiterate that the problem is not you understanding me. I speak quite clearly. The problem is me understanding that person, especially during a pandemic when everyone has to wear masks. For the safety of me, I prefer you not to take off your mask. I prefer to have my access needs met, though, still. And so finding a way to do that safely during COVID has been difficult, especially with those assumptions on board. I am very capable of communicating my needs to other people, and I'm very capable of understanding what's being said or told to me if I have the right access needs.
I'll tell you something else, folks, that I learned from Noorjahan. At least this is what my notes say about our conversation. Access has to be defined by what the person with the disability explains it is, not the assumptions of those who are supposed to be providing the accessibility. Real quickly, I just have got to get a sort of a feel from Emma about what you had to go through in the 72 hours, or I don't know, 4 days, whatever it was, leading up to the birth of Noorjahan's daughter.
This is one of those situations where I think I just channeled the fire that Noorjahan already had, because Noorjahan had been fighting for this. He knew that this was his right. This is so crystal clear, and had already been fighting for it for 8.5 months. And so I came in at the very end and was able to just keep my foot down with the legal hammer, so to speak, and make sure that the hospital did the right thing. But it frankly was a ridiculous problem in the first place, and thankfully one that once there was a little bit of legal backing, the hospital did get in line and, to their credit, coordinate to have an ASL interpreter for the entire, I think it was 5 days that we asked for, right, Noorjahan, to make sure that from the moment of your intake through the, your discharge at the end, that you would have an ASL interpreter, and thankfully that came to be.
I can just remember us. I'm emailing Emma. So what happened? Is everything okay? What's going on? What's going on? And it was literally a race against the clock. And Noorjahan was aware of that, which of course isn't the greatest thing for somebody who is going through any significant medical event anyway. Now, I want to introduce you all to somebody whose work I tremendously admire, and that is Catherine Salado. You're sitting at the Brooklyn DA's office, which is actually a walk away from where I'm sitting right now. But the work that you do and the program within which you work is unique nationally, if not internationally. And so I'd like you to tell folks a bit about it. And then you're all going to ask yourselves, why in the world is Catherine and her team the only group that's doing it?
Yeah, so I'm a social worker at the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office, and I'm here in the office right now. We did not get the opportunity to work from home. And my program, we have many programs serving many communities, but one of the programs that we have specifically is for individuals with disabilities and helping those individuals navigate the criminal justice system. Specifically survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault, but we, will assist in any of the crimes that take place in Brooklyn as needed. And it's not a large program. There's only about 3 of us. But we help people from the opening of a case to the closing of a case, from the incident taking place through to trial, all the way past trial as needed. And we're the only, to my knowledge, I know we're the only DA's office in the 5 boroughs that has this, but I think we might be the only one nationally that has this kind of program to help individuals with disabilities navigate the criminal justice system.
I came to know of your program when it was previously referred to as barrier-free justice, which is an extraordinary, extraordinary concept that we all need to be striving for in our systems. Now, I think that you're, Catherine, kind of uniquely qualified to talk to us about communication issues relating to people with significant mental illness, where their diagnoses does in fact impact on the way that they communicate and process information. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that in the context of the court system, particularly in this case, those who were survivors of violent crime, things like that.
Yeah, so I would say that my area of work is with individuals with serious mental illnesses, and working with them to communicate. It's interesting because I'm almost a little bit like a translator, not completely, but because I try to, my role involves a lot of like making sure other professionals understand, right? So, it's the prosecutor's office. The goal of the office is to prosecute crimes. And the people who do that are lawyers. But a lot of our lawyers aren't familiar with mental illness, and they're not familiar with what that symptomology looks like, and they're not familiar with what sometimes that language pattern looks like. And so a lot of what I do is advocating for my survivors to make sure that they're getting the access to justice that they are entitled to by our society. And so a really interesting example of this is individuals who experience some kind of delusions. I had for a while this case where the individual believed that she was an undercover FBI agent ridding New York City of all of its crack dealers. That was definitely a delusion. But that didn't mean, the fact that she experienced this delusion didn't mean that her domestic violence wasn't happening. So it was about advocating on her behalf and ensuring that the legal people understood that, yes, she experiences delusions, but her her household is still violent. She is still experiencing domestic violence, regardless of the fact that she is in fact not an undercover FBI agent. So there's a lot of that, but there's also a lot of assessing and working with people to figure out if their priorities are their mental health or if their priorities are the legal health of a case. So we see a lot of people who are very seriously suicidal. And so we have to talk to them about whether or not pursuing a criminal case is going to make these symptoms worse, or, you know, what is best for them and what they want, and whether they think they're up to a trial or can even want to sustain a criminal case, which could take up to 3 to 5 years, depending on the severity of the crime. So it's a lot of working with people to make sure that their needs and what's best for them is known to the folks on the legal side who ultimately get to make the decisions about a prosecution.
It's so interesting because the same themes it seems to me, keep recurring over and over again. Taking the time to know what the way that person communicates is and what it means and what it doesn't mean, right? I mean, certainly those of us who work are privileged to work in our PAMI program see folks who communicate in a non-linear fashion, but the legal system, including probably from the moment that a police officer is notified if something happened, or a public defender who's representing the interests of that person, is sort of programmed sometimes to want the facts to be given in a linear way. So unless we educate ourselves and learn that person's means of communication, it seems to me we're not in a position to make credibility determinations and to really truly make the system accessible to that person. Dr. Mudrick, I know that we've talked a bit about your work with mental health and how, again, the communication issues come into play in terms of access to all the various systems that folks have to access. Did you want to share some of your observations in that regard?
Well, I was thinking two things as you were speaking, and one is that this is with reference to healthcare systems, not the court. That someone comes in and with a disability, and it could be a psychiatric disability or it could be a physical disability. And often the healthcare provider is so fixated on that they aren't attending to the healthcare problem that the patient is really seeking help for. So it's sort of parallel with what you were just speaking about in terms of court cases, that there's an assumption that this person isn't coming in for care for anything other than the disability, when in fact, the individual may be worried about high cholesterol or other typical health problems that need to be attended to as well. So there is then this communication mismatch between what the patient is interested in having attended to and what the provider may assume based on stereotypes and prejudice. So that was sort of one thought. The second one is actually from a different study that I did a couple of years ago. It's specifically with people with serious mental illness, was that oftentimes getting organized up for that healthcare visit, and I think that's what you were referencing, Mark, earlier, was the biggest barrier to getting healthcare was that stack of forms that you get mailed when you sign up for a position that you have to fill in before you go. It is a really daunting thing, and many of the patients with serious mental illness don't get into basic healthcare that they need because this is a big barrier, having to respond to this big stack of papers or to do necessary pre-testing, get your blood taken before you go for your physical. And then even waiting in the office. If you're an anxious person, you're sitting in that office for who knows how long, and people are coming in and out, and doors are sometimes, I've been in some of these offices where doors are slamming as people are coming in and out. And it's a very anxious setting. And for someone who's already anxious, has serious problems with anxiety, for example, this is a huge discouragement from healthcare. And one of the things, to me, a really shocking statistic that's well known at this point is that on average, people with serious mental illness have a 25-year shorter lifespan than other people. And the cause of mortality are the standard healthcare problems that everybody else has: diabetes, high blood pressure, cardiac problems. I mean, those are the biggest contributors. So what that says is these are people who aren't getting into healthcare, and somehow the system is not welcoming to them, is not accommodating them so that they can actually participate and have the same healthcare that everybody else has.
You remind me that we've been hearing from folks over the course of the last 2 years or so that for folks with significant mental illness, telehealth has been wonderful, because they didn't have to worry about, getting out of bed and getting showered and getting on the mass transit and all of that and getting there. And, one would hope that specifically when it includes the communication issues at play with accessing things, that we learn some things from the COVID experience instead of just trying to get back to, the old normal. And that's why data folks like you that are kind of accumulating information and we can use it in support of policy changes are so important. So I wondered, I was going to turn back to our first speaker and ask you, Sabina, if in the context of your work, either as a member of our mental illness program or your past work as a public defender with folks who may have had some diagnoses, if some of these communication issues resonated with you.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think I found both at my work here at DRNY and my work prior to working at DRNY as a public defender that there's the failure to provide access to communication for people with disabilities comes at the detriment of their individual liberties, regardless of what system you're in, whether it's a guardianship proceeding, whether it's a criminal proceeding. And I was just like, I could give you many stories, but I was just recalling part of my work prior to being a public defender was speaking with individuals who were placed in what's called the box at Rikers Island, which is where they'd be placed in solitary confinement if they were violated, for example, for disrespecting a corrections officer. And I recall this client that I had who experienced severe sensory overload. And the way to communicate with the client was you had to very softly speak with the client. And if you raise your voice even a little bit, the client was just would freeze, and they couldn't communicate because they would just freeze up and they would start screaming. And so obviously as their attorney, well, I wasn't an attorney at that point, but as their advocate, I understood that. But unfortunately, individuals in the correction system and the jail system, they're not all trained to understand how to communicate with the various individuals. And unfortunately, they, in the criminal justice system, punish individuals for disability-related conduct as a result of them not understanding the methods of communication and comprehension, and not understanding that communication and comprehension are not the same across the board for all people. And so going back to that client, they were consistently placed in the box in solitary confinement because every time they would be screamed at by a corrections officer, they would react, and that reaction would ultimately cause them to have a ticket and be placed in solitary confinement. And so this specific person was in solitary confinement for about 8 months 2 months at a time, but they were consistently placed in solitary confinement because the employees at the jail at Rikers didn't understand that you have to communicate with this person in a specific way, and that this person communicates in a specific way if they're having sensory overload.
Of course, it seems to me also that the risk under such circumstances is that the frustration for the person who experiences this sensory overload, is interpreted by those who are making decisions that impact their life as some sort of, agitation or violent propensity. And then that's how folks with disabilities end up going down, a criminal track where help and, supportive services are what we really need to be focusing on. I feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that in the context of communication, we here at DRNY are always learning about particular disabilities that have particular communication qualities about them. One of them being traumatic brain injury, and some of them being things like hypermobility disabilities and things like that. Noorjahan, I thought you may want to comment on that as part of your lived experience.
Yeah, sure. So I have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome and also a traumatic brain injury. Going back a little ways, actually, I spent some time in a nursing home, and this was after I had lost my hearing, and communication was a problem. And even like leading to this day, it's still been a problem where I need access to be able to tell people how to move me, how to help me move, how to transfer. I use a wheelchair, but because of the hypermobility, the wheelchair is from the brain injury. But if with a hypermobility, if I am picked up under the shoulders like this, my shoulders both dislocate, which could lead to further injury and could lead to them dropping me. And a lot of times I run into that problem where it's not understood that it's not my choice. It's not that I want to be picked up a different way, that I want to be moved a different way. It's not a preference. It's a safety concern. And by having that communication need respected, then I'm safer, and so is everyone helping me. And that's also why it's really important to make sure you're communicating as like physicians or providers or whatever with the person with disability to find out even something so simple as what's the best way to help you move? What's the best thing for us to do right now? Is it better to let you transfer on your own? Is it better to help you? How can we make sure we're doing this safely? But part of that means that you have to already have an understandable and established, like workable, successful line of communication in place. So it goes back to the time again.
By the way, I'm thinking back to Catherine that the system in which you are required to operate is one where I want to make sure everybody knows time is absolutely of the essence. We're talking about grand jury proceedings that have, a certain amount of days within which you have to operate. Court systems, judges who have too many cases on their docket. So how does one advocate for the amount of time to be spent? I'm even thinking back to experiences I've had with like victim impact statements and things like that. How do you do it?
It depends on the person and how receptive they are. So I use all of the tricks of the social work trade. Sometimes I just tell people what's going to happen and that they can just deal with it. Sometimes I pull out the motivational interviewing and I bring them around to my idea and make them think it's their idea. Whatever, it's really a question of whatever it takes. As a social worker, I have like training in having people skills, but like in talking to people and helping them see things that maybe they didn't see before. And I use that both when conducting the forensic interviews with the person who is the survivor of this crime, but also when talking to the people I'm advocating on their behalf to. We joke all the time here as among the social workers that we are as much counselors to our survivors as we are to the lawyers. Because we turn our skills on both parties.
Yeah, I mean, it's all of our obligation to keep learning, right? And but what's so interesting is that so many of the things that we're talking about is creative ways to work around the system rather than us and everybody who's joined us today, and we'll go, forward and continue this conversation, working to change the system, at least incrementally, so that these considerations are built in. I kind of, by the way, there's been questions about how to reach DRNY. We can always be reached via drny.org. I hope that people take advantage of these opportunities, seeing each other's professional affiliations to connect with each other so we can continue this conversation. I really did want to kind of end where we started with, Michael, based upon your experience over the last several years, and then having to navigate your healthcare and your access to the courts, what would your takeaway be to somebody who may be in your position right now, but not have some of the advocacy skills, self-advocacy skills that you have developed? What should they know? What have you learned?
What do you mean? He said.
In other words, what would, if you met somebody who was in your position right now, but they hadn't had the opportunity to work with lawyers, hadn't had the opportunity to work with other kinds of advocates, what would you like them to know? What should they be fighting for?
They should fight for DRNY to help them.
Wow. All right. So how about, well, thank you. That came off like a great free ad, but I'll take it as they should be fighting for more advocates to make themselves aware of what the problems are. And I also want to end with the thought that you, Michael, and you, Noorjahan, and probably some other folks that have joined us on the car have become great self-advocates. And so the process of navigating that system is for you to simply, use your voice and demand that the accommodations be provided for you to use your voice. And for those of us that have gathered today to continue to pool our thoughts and resources to try and change the system in the ways that we can uncover. Well, I'm so grateful to all of the, yes, Noorjahan, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, because you were mentioning what others could do,
Right.
not just disabled folks. So I kind of just wanted to end my kind of portion with this really cool quote from a really prolific Black author named Mickey Kendall. And it says, "We don't need allies, we need accomplices. Fighting oppression isn't a spectator sport. Allies cheer you on. Accomplices wade in and fight too." So from a disability perspective, that's what I would want my allies to do for me.
Thank you. All right. Well, with Noorjahan having dropped the mic, I'm not going to speak any other words other than to say thank you so much for joining us. Let's maintain communication. Let us know if there are other topics that you would like us to come to cover going forward, and let's continue our advocacy together. Thank you all so much for joining us.